Mary. The room was dark. The walls were adobe, or something made to look like adobe. I reached out one hand and touched the wall. It was adobe, smooth, cool to the touch. A little girl's face suddenly appeared from the darkness. She had apparently been laying next to the bed. "Why are you sleeping there?" I asked her. It was a wonder that I thought to whisper, and it was probably only due to my lack of water I had. "You are sleeping in my bed," she whispered back. My head was better, but my legs seemed worse. I had no idea how I had gotten there. I tried to move, to sit up, and she stopped me. I got far enough up to see that my leg was heavily bandaged up past the knee. A second later, I had passed out once more and sunken down into the black hole that seemed to draw me. Sunday. I looked down at the car's interior. Keys hung from the switch. I didn't have a lot of hope, but I twisted the key and the starter began to turn over. Slow, barely there, but then it picked up speed in a rush, and the car stuttered to life, coughed, nearly quit, and then smoothed out and began to warm up. The car had come from cash I had found in one of the bags. Mary, that was the little girl, had an uncle who had purchased the car and delivered it to me early that morning. I had given her some cash, but her grandmother had made her give it back. In the end, that was probably for the best. I was out of whatever was going on, but all four of the bags held a great deal of cash. I had no doubt that someone would come looking for it. No sense sending alarms by giving a poor family what amounted to a fortune. Neighbors would know. Friends. There would be no hiding. The muffler was loud. One side of the windshield was a starred mess, but the gas gauge stood at 3/4 of a tank. I shifted the car into first and pulled from the side of the road, bumping over the cracked and tilted pavement as I went. The driving was slow going, but 4 hours later I reached the outskirts of Phoenix. Was I really this close to home the last few days and nights? How much time had slipped by, I wondered, but I had no answers. When I reached Logan Street, I pulled into the garage and shut the door. The old Ford sat where he had left it. Blood and gore baked a deep maroon to black in the heat of the garage. Home. The leg was bad, swollen against the pants material. The rags that had been wrapped around it stopped the blood flow, but had done nothing for infection. I sat in a kitchen chair, peeled the rags away now, taking a good part of my skin with them, and looked the wound over. Something had punched a deep hole into my leg. The whole area had pulled away. The area that had pulled away was oozing pus now, the skin around it red and swollen. I had taken a bottle of peroxide from the bathroom, some antibiotic cream, iodine, and some bandage. All of it old, but still, I hoped, useful. I scrounged up a fast meal while I worked up the nerve to work on the leg. I probably wouldn't feel like eating afterwards. I had no fever, and I counted that as a good thing. I finished some crackers and 3 bottles of cheap beer before I limped off to find what I still needed. In an old box in my grandmother's bedroom, I found a small knitting needle. The point was sharp. It was wide enough to allow me to push it in to get to the abscess I was sure was there. I carried it back to the kitchen and then decided maybe something more than the beer to help with the pain might help. I searched, but there was nothing stronger than the beer. The drugstore nearby probably had some pain pills I could get without a prescription, but I would have to get dressed, chance driving the little car, or worse yet, the old Ford, and that was too much risk. Maybe later, I decided. I had an old prescription for antibiotics. I had had it filled and never used it. The doctor had given me enough samples to see me through, and so I had never taken the prescription. It had sat in the medicine cabinet for a few months, but I was sure that it would still be okay. Besides, it would have to be. It was all that I had. Reluctantly, I limped back to the kitchen and sat on the floor with my back against the cabinets as I arranged the items I needed around me. The peroxide came first. I poured half the bottle over the wound. It bubbled and then ran across the warm kitchen floor as it dripped from my leg. There was some pain, but the bubbling and foam that appeared told me what I had already guessed. The infection was bad. I spun the top off the iodine, spilled a little into the dimple of the puncture wound, and then inserted the knitting needle into the bottle and left it to soak in the iodine. I was reasonably sure it would disinfect it. The pain was intense when the iodine hit the raw wound, but it abated after a few moments. I picked up the needle, but just touching the wound with it sent a shock wave of pain up my leg. I stopped, stretched backwards against the cabinets, bracing myself firmly. My breathing was hard and fast. Tears had squirted from my eyes and stained my dirty cheeks as they rolled away to my jawline. Sweat had instantly broke out of my bra. I couldn't stop at a mere touch. I had to shove the needle down far enough to be sure I punctured the abscess so it would drain. I steeled myself, took a deep breath, centered the needle over the dimple, and drove it down into my leg before I could think about it anymore. The pain came fast, but my mind shut down just as quickly. I had awakened hours later, the sunlight lower through the front windows. The leg was draining freely, fresh blood now, but I could see that the poison had also drained. My head felt better, my stomach more settled. I took my time and grimaced only slightly as I poured first the remaining peroxide into the wound, and then the balance of the iodine. Both hurt, but the pain was nothing like it had been. Antibiotic cream and some bandages, and I was finished. I sat staring down at my hands. Dirt, blood, who knew what else? I made my feet and limped off to my bedroom. A few minutes later I closed my eyes, where I was stretched out on the bed, the blackness finally closing in completely. Wednesday. A few days of rest had made a huge difference in how I felt, and my leg had responded as I had hoped it would. It was still stiff. Something was wrong in the knee, maybe, but I could walk, and the more I walked, the better I felt. I sat in a chair on my front porch now, drinking hot coffee. Morning was coming on. It was still early. The neighborhood was a crazy place at night, but during the daylight hours you would never know just how dangerous it could be after dark. I had believed I would never see my own house on Logan Street again. It was both amazing and unbelievable at the same time, like I was simply waiting for the other shoe to drop. Something was still going to happen. Just that uneasiness in you after something really bad happens to you. I guess you might not know about that if nothing really bad has ever happened to you. A little work and I had managed to clean up the Ford. All while I was doing it, I had no idea why I was doing it. I had driven it to the drugstore, picked up more supplies, and even managed to get the antibiotics prescription refilled. It had had a refill, and it had been good for 90 days. I had just made that deadline. The grocery store. There was a cord of wood that had been stacked outside the back steps that led down into the basement forever. I couldn't remember how many years. I had never used the wood stove after the new heating system had been put in, but in the old days my grandfather had heated the entire house with it. I had promised myself that someday I would yank it out. I was glad I had never gotten around to it. I had taken another dose of antibiotics, along with 3 aspirin, and had fallen asleep in my own bed and slept for, I don't know how long. But time didn't really matter a great deal anymore. I had slept a long time. I didn't know how long a period. I didn't care. I only cared that I had awakened with the headache gone, the swelling in my leg lessened, and the redness mostly gone when I redressed the wounds. And it had been Wednesday morning. That seemed unbelievable to me, but it was true. I had taken another dose of antibiotics, skipped the aspirin, and restocked the wood stove before I ate breakfast of canned meat and toast laid on top of the glowing wood stove. I had been sitting there trying to figure out what to do. Something, maybe while I had slept, had worked its way into my brain, and it would not leave. What if, my thoughts had asked, what if Kat was not dead? What if she had survived? Wouldn't they have wanted to keep her alive? And the Mexican? It troubled me because how could I know it? I had been badly injured. I had looked around, but right now in the clear light of day, removed by a few days of rest, I couldn't be sure what I had seen, or what I had looked at, how well I had searched, whether she was there, gone, dead, alive. There was no way to know except to go back and find out, my mind supplied. I sat there sipping at the hot coffee, looking for reasons to ignore the thought that had just seemed to drop in on me, but I could not. I had 4 bags full of money, and who knew what all? I had still not checked them over, yet I had to go back. I had to be sure, and it wasn't just about Kat. Maybe she was gone, maybe she wasn't. But what about the Mexican? They had probably ignored me because I had appeared dead. I must have appeared dead. Hell, I had been halfway to dead. They must have checked the truck, thought I was dead, and left me. Didn't that mean that the other 2 were alive? Wouldn't they be? Wouldn't they have left them if they had been dead? What good to them would they have been if they were dead? I sighed, leaned forward, and the legs of the chair came down the floorboards of the porch. There was nothing for it, and no reason to put it off. There was nothing here. This life was dead as dog shit, as they used to say. What had happened had completely changed me. I didn't belong here anymore. But going could get me killed, I thought. It could get you killed, I said aloud. And it could, I agreed with myself, with my own thoughts, but that made no difference either. I stood, drained the cup, and set it down empty on the rail. A half hour later, I was winding through the stalled traffic, heading out of Phoenix towards Mexico. Thursday. I sat quietly in the dark, my weapons gathered around me. I had gathered them from their own arsenal, and they hadn't even missed them. They, the people running this section of the small town in Sonora, might think that they had their shit together, but they were nothing but amateurs. They were brave because they did not expect anyone to attack them. They believed that they had bribed the right politicians and police, and the townspeople were thoroughly frightened of them. Who could touch them? So they had taken no precautions at all. They took no care with what they did or how they did it. They posted guards who whiled away their duty, playing cards and drinking. I had looked the weapons over several times. I thought out my plans more than a dozen times. There was nothing left but to do it. I had seen enough to know what was going on here. The entire territory had been divided by different gangs. I had watched for the last 2 days and nights, walking boldly where I wished to in the daylight, sticking to the hard shadows through the night. I couldn't ask for a better picture. At night, the small village lit up. The soldiers walked the streets. Whores that worked for the gangs plied their trades. Drunken fights erupted. The village lights gave the outlaws a false sense of security at night. I had worked my way in, and I had seen everything I needed to see, and then made my way back out in the gray light of morning that first day. Since then, I had slipped easily back and forth across their lines, as if they didn't even exist. I had started with the wreck. It sat where I had left it on the outskirts of the city, resting in a ditch. I had walked by on the road with some locals on their way into the outlaw village and looked it over as we passed. The car lot itself had been full of workers, but no police or federales had been there. Nightfall had paid dividends. I followed a returning group on foot with prisoners and slipped right back into the protected area along with them. From there, I had simply followed those they had brought in to where they were pulled and shoved along the streets to a small hovel of run-down shacks that bordered a huge open dumping area. The shacks were guarded, but again, they were guarded to make sure no one escaped, not to keep people from slipping in. And even that was slipshod. It had been late today before I had seen her, and I had wept freely as they had dragged her from the building's front door, along with the Mexicans and a few others I didn't recognize. Apparently, they'd kidnapped anyone along the roads that led through Sonora. The ransom business paid well in some cases. In other cases where ransom could not be obtained, life was cheap. They could sell those they could not ransom, work the others to death in the desert heat. I shuddered to think of what they might have been through over the last few days before I had made my escape and then finally decided to come back. It was too much to take in, and so I had shut it down and followed them as they were dragged through the hard-packed streets, barefoot, to another building and turned over to some armed men there. My mind had screamed at me, do something right now, but my common sense had fought it down. That would be suicide. It would benefit no one. It would surely get me killed, and probably them too, if they realized that I had come here to free them. They had not been long at the building. Those that had bought them had stood around talking, low tones, subdued. It seems they were none too happy about their own circumstances. It had been on the way back, after they had brought them back out and were heading them to their prison, that I had overheard their conversation. The Mexican was alive because they suspected that he had connections, and that those connections would pay for his release. So far he had failed to contact them, but they had beaten him several times. Most likely they would kill him soon if he didn't reach them. Kat was a different story. She had been brought over to be looked over by some rival gang who might purchase her as part of some kind of trade. From the sounds of the conversation, they had liked what they'd seen. The deal would go down tomorrow if they decided to go through with it. The deal would go down tomorrow if they decided to go with it. If I intended to get them out alive, it would have to be tonight. It had not taken long to gather what I needed. I had found weapons of every kind, rifles, pistols, knives, hand grenades even. I had stolen them and brought them to the open dump in back of the ramshackle housing where I had been hiding and watching the prison. There was nothing left to do. The dump was the perfect place to wait out nightfall. The smell of fresh garbage loads as they were dumped had made me sure at first that I would not be able to stay there. But the same things that nearly drove me out kept everyone else away, and so several hours into my wait, I realized that I could no longer smell the putrid mounds of garbage. A few minutes before, as I sat watching, the guard had changed. The night shift consisted of only 2 guards, and they were already sharing a joint together out back of the buildings. I heard their low voices and laughter as I worked my way through the twisting mounds of garbage, bringing only what I needed and around to the front of the house. I hesitated at the front door. I was fairly certain there was no one inside, but I couldn't be positive. Anyone could have slipped in while I was out in the dump and unable to see the front of the house. I closed my eyes for a moment, shifted the pistol in my hand slightly, and then reached down and turned the knob. The door swung open on a dark interior. Cold, no heat, no sounds. I stepped inside. Midnight. It had almost gone without a hitch. It had taken me a few minutes for my eyes to adjust, but once they had, I set off through the house. I thought back on it now as I bent my weight to the shovel I was using, digging more out of the bottom of the shallow grave. As I searched, my eyes had begun to tell me things too. They were upstairs. I could hear minute creaks as body weight shifted on the floors above me. I could hear weeping from somewhere above me too. The sound made a sob catch in my throat before I choked it back and headed for the stairs. The Mexican had been out in the open, tied to a post for the railings. I had caught him in the process of trying to fight his way free. His mouth was gagged, but he immediately stopped his struggles when I came into view at the top of the stairs. I bent forward carefully, the step creaking loudly, and cut the bonds on his wrists. A second later, I was passing the Mexican's pistol as he worked to free his jaw. I passed him a canteen, and the Mexican sipped carefully, his lips blistered and cut. Before he handed it back, his voice was scratchy, rusty. "Kill the ones out there?" the Mexican asked in a whisper croak. His eyes were hard. I shook my head. "We're getting high. They won't be a problem. Where is Kat?" The Mexican motioned with his head, and we started down the hallway. He stopped in front of a door. A guard went in a little while ago. Probably. He shook his head. I whispered. We'll go on 3. Fast. But don't let the door make a lot of noise. Try to stab him, not shoot. We don't want to alert those 2 others. I held the Mexican's eyes until he nodded. I turned the knob slowly and counted down quickly. My shoulder hit the door, but it didn't give completely. Just flexed, cracked loudly, and then sprang back at us. I cursed under my breath. Take it down, take it fucking down, the Mexican whispered croaked. The door splintered and finally opened. The guard inside was waiting, a gun in one hand, the form of a nude female beside him. A vague shape tied to a chair across the room. A hand rose and pulled the gun down. The gun went off as we were tackling him, and then everything went bad fast. I drew my knife across his throat to cut a scream that had begun. But I knew it was too late. The Mexican scrambled up and made his way to a chair and began untying the woman. I bent, pushed the man aside, and saw Kat. She moved quickly, and I pulled her to her feet. We were out the door seconds later, all armed with the pistols I had brought with me, scrambling down the stairs 2 at a time. The front door suddenly burst in as we hit the bottom of the stairs, and the 2 men that came through never stood a chance. We shot them point blank, and then ran over the top of them as they were still falling and spilled out into the night. The whole area was on alert. The guards were out, dogs running everywhere. I saw the dogs were no problem. It was like the movies. It wasn't like the movies. The dogs didn't know who they were looking for. We managed to make it 3 blocks north, nearly out, before I realized that the other girl the Mexican had grabbed had been hit. She stumbled. He pulled her to her feet, but she stumbled again. When I looked back, I saw the blood that covered her entire side and soaked her leg. There was no time. I bent and took her over my shoulder, hearing her cry out in pain as I did, feeling my legs scream out as well, threatening to buckle, but there had been no other option. We had made the open desert a few moments later, and had to stop while we planned our next move. There were too many of them, dozens searching, but they were not trained to do it. Most of them had never hunted, didn't know how to watch or even what to look for. I had lain the girl, Amber, I found out later, on the ground, and Kat had pulled her into her arms and held her, both crying silently. Behind us, several blocks back at the house where they had been held, the grenades I had rigged to a timer finally went off. The men scattered, ran, started to regroup, and then began to run through the streets back to where they had been. I picked up Amber again and ran through the darkness, sticking to the deepest shadows for the next half mile, until we were well beyond the city and the gangs that were out looking for us. The Mexican and I collapsed onto the ground, and Kat held Amber as she died. Dawn had not been far away, so we had taken refuge at a nearby barn and waited the day away. No one had come near. We had rested up during that time, and when it was dark once more, we had left the shelter and brought Amber with us. Now I bent to the shovel once again. We had all taken turns, and the hole was nearly done. I took a deep breath, stepped away from the hole, and the others nodded. A second later, they were lowering Amber into the hole. She was dressed in the same blood-soaked clothing we had taken her from the house in just a short time before. Her face pasty white, smeared with dried blood, but peaceful nonetheless. A half hour later, we were moving again, staying to the fields as we went, and away from the dirt road that meandered through the countryside. We had a half-mile to travel, a short distance, I had thought, when I had hidden the old Ford I had driven here, but a long walk now that we knew they might be anywhere looking for us. We finished up the trip a short time later and made our way to the falling down garage next to a flattened diner where I had hidden the truck.